This podcast is produced by the Center for Deployment Psychology at the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences. The views expressed are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Uniformed Services University, the Department of Defense, or the U.S. government. In addition, references to any specific companies, products, processes, or services does not necessarily constitute or imply endorsement by the Uniformed Services University, the Department of Defense, or the U.S. government. Welcome to CDP's podcast, Practical for Your Practice,
where we give you actionable intel to support what you do.
One colleague to another.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Practical for Your Practice. I'm Corinne Lefkowitz, and I'm joined today by both of my esteemed co-hosts, Kevin Holloway and Jenna Ermold. Hello, friends.
Woo! Hey!
I'm very glad to be here all together. This is we don't get to do this. It is rare.
Yeah, this is a special day, which is why we got a woo out of Kevin, I think.
It's true. I don't normally woo.
Yeah. Thanks for bringing the energy.
You're welcome. I mean, I'm excited. We're all here.
We're
we don't
all
get to do
here.
this very often.
Correct. And we've got a great topic to talk about today, which is how we use collateral information in treatment. But before we get to that topic, I have exciting news to share with you all, which is that I received some feedback from a listener about the podcast, and I wanted to share it with everybody.
Nice.
So our friend and listener, Lauren in North Carolina, she wrote, I just finally subscribed to Practical for Your Practice, and I've listened to about 5 episodes back to back. I particularly love the confessional episodes, and I just wanted to let you know it's such a valuable resource, kind of getting me back on the train to do some consultation again.
Hey.
That's fabulous.
I think that's great considering that we plug consultation almost every episode. Apparently it's landing.
Nice.
But
what nice feedback from Lauren. Thanks, Lauren.
I was going to say that's super nice feedback, and ultimately, we love hearing that it's enjoyable to listen to, but the best part of that is that it's inspiring her to want to go back to consultation, which, doesn't get better than that.
Right?
True. I would say I think the confessional episodes are some of my favorites too. Those were a lot of fun.
True. They were
we
pretty
may
great.
Even need to revisit those in the future.
I think so. Not only our own confessionals, but also hearing from our guests, hearing their confessionals were great too.
Yep.
And you listeners out there, if you'd like us to do more confessionals, let us know.
Yeah.
Message. Yes. We would love to hear your feedback about what we should be doing or do again.
And maybe even your own EBP confessional if you would like to share that too.
Yeah, that's right. We're always looking for confessions.
Well, like that. As you can see, we're excited to hear from our listeners all the time. So reach out to us. Information on how to do that is, of course, in our show notes. And we hope to hear from you.
Yeah.
But let's get on with our episode for today, yes?
Mm-hmm.
I was kind of thinking back to how we came to this topic. And I think all of us have personal experience, but professional personal experience and then consultation experience with this topic of collaterals. And we're going to define what we mean by that, but just want to maybe set the stage for the why behind. And part of our conversation, and obviously this is true for all of you who think about this, is obviously for the work that we do as behavioral health providers. I think many of us wish sometimes we could do lab work or have some sort of imaging or some sort of physical exam and be like, yep, it's definitely, major depression or, but we just don't have that, right? We don't have those objective measures. And so we're really relying so heavily on what our clients are telling us, and what we're observing about their behaviors. And, for the most part, that's great and sufficient. And we usually get the data that we need, but we're also sort of getting one side of the story or, in the angst of kind of talking about what's been going on, important details get missed. And so this idea of getting additional information from people who might be close to that client or patient is really important in getting the diagnosis right, but then we'll talk a little later about also as they go through treatment. and sort of the notion that this isn't just like a good, nice thing to do, but it's
Mm-hmm.
actually kind of a best practice thing to do to get that collateral information um, from some sort of support network so that we can really adequately diagnose it and treat the clients that we work with. So, and even some research to show that when we do that, um, there are actually lower rates of morbidity, faster recovery, and decreased risk of relapse. So again,
Hmm.
not just a nice thing to do. But like, given that background, what do we mean by collaterals? Who are these people? What does that look like in your
Yeah.
experience?
Yeah.
I was thinking about, as you described that, it made a lot of sense to me that, when you even mentioned our behavioral observations of our client, and it occurred to me like that's a very limited, restricted space, right? Like we're watching their behavior in our office where there's certain expectations and norms perhaps that they're following or not, but this isn't the rest of their day-to-day life. So we're, unless we're following them around, going back to their homes, seeing them how they're interacting at their jobs or whatever that may be, it's still a
Which,
very
Kevin, you're
limited.
not supposed to do. You're not supposed to do that with your clients,
Okay,
FYI.
I will take a note. But that's a lot of information we don't have, partly because a lot of the mental health issues that we're dealing with and we're hypothesizing, we're assessing for, can have an impact on a person's own observations of themselves, or how they're interpreting their own behavior as well. So like it's limited by the fact that the very thing that we're trying to assess for might actually be
Mhm.
interfering with our ability to
Hmm.
assess for it.
Hmm. It's interesting that you said it that way. I don't disagree with you at all, but I was thinking about the fact that that all of my practice right now is telehealth. And
Hmm.
in that
Mm,
way, I feel like I get a little bit more of a window into
Yeah.
what a client's life is actually like, or what their personality is, what their environment is like, how much they can carve out time for our appointments, et cetera. But it's still limited. Even with that greater insight, it's still what the patient, what the client chooses to present to me,
Hmm.
right.
um, which, as Jenna said, is usually enough, but there are times where having collateral information can really make a difference.
Yeah.
So Jenna had asked, who are the collaterals that you think about? For me, since I work with adults and I've primarily worked with adults my whole career, I mostly think about partners,
Hmm.
spouses. When I worked in college counseling, maybe roommates as well.
Hmm.
Mm.
Um, but obviously, there's a much bigger world out there, and collateral. There will
Right.
be different collaterals if you're working more routinely with kids or adolescents or families.
I was even thinking too. Most of my work has been with adults as well, and most of my work has been with adults connected to the military in one way or another. I've worked in military hospital clinics and such, and so an important collateral source for us there too was oftentimes like their immediate supervisor, right, or their commander, that somebody in their
Mm,
chain of command that maybe observes their behavior on a day-to-day basis at work in their military career. And of course, that's one I didn't immediately think about when I started working in those settings, because I like you, I immediately think of a significant other, a spouse, perhaps a partner.
hmm
um, and of course, depending on what it is we're talking about, if I'm interested in their sleep, for example, how they're sleeping, how much of sleep they're getting, are they tossing and turning a lot? Probably not asking their commander, but you know, so it depends a little bit. But yeah, I mean, I think collateral can mean more than just that, that significant other, that partner, that spouse. It can be other people who would have relevant information.
hmm
Well, and I think obviously we're going to talk about, how we're collaborating with our client on this. But I mean, I
Hmm.
also want to just make sure listeners know if somebody's coming to get treatment at a military treatment facility, we don't automatically reach out to command. We don't, like, it
Right.
is
Right.
very private. It is, all the things that we would do with any client we are doing with that service member. So it's under unique circumstances that we would, a command directed evaluation, or if they say, hey, I actually would love for you to talk to my command and get their sense.
Yep.
But it's not something that is sort of an immediate thing we would do.
I certainly have asked a client's permission to
Yeah.
talk to a commander and go through all the same things we would do in any other setting, right? Getting that release of information signed by them with their understanding that it's limited scope and limited time, and they can withdraw it at any time, and all that kind of stuff, and talking to them about what I learned afterwards, that was all part of it. So it wasn't like I was sneaking behind anybody's back or trying to get extra information. And even in command directed evaluations that I did, it was still very limited. Like the whoever was making the referral could, you know, say what their observations were in that referral. They
Mm-hmm.
could certainly ask specific questions, and to me, that was an important thing. This wasn't just a general fishing expedition. Is that there needed to be a very specific question that was being asked as far as this, command directed evaluation was, and that's usually things like safety. Is this person safe?
Hmm.
Are they, are they in a ready position for, say, deployment or something else, given these things I've observed? So yeah, I mean, it wasn't just certainly commanders do not have access to mental health notes. There was a lot of protection of confidentiality in that space, just like outside of the a military space.
I hope that we've done a good enough job of clarifying what privacy might look like in an active duty setting. Perhaps we can shift gears a
Yes.
little bit and talk more about sort of our experiences and more practical general applications of this. I don't know if either of you have come to this discussion with some specific ways in which you have found um, input from collaterals to be particularly useful.
Hmm.
And I'm happy to go first, but I also can go last.
I have a story.
Yeah, go for it.
Um, and I will change the details of the story, obviously, so it's not precisely precise, but I had been working with a patient who was postpartum, but kind of far enough along that her sleep maybe could have been a little more restored than it was. Um, and, we had done a lot of um, assessment around her, her sleep habits and her schedule and, some of the things that might be impacting her sleep. And then invited her spouse to come in. She thought he might, have some good information. And he brought up the very important part that the two of them were sleeping on a double air bed and
Wow.
had been for 4 months, and he was 6'4".
Mm,
And it's kind of funny, right? Because like that was just really key missing information
right.
that, she was so focused on these other areas, and that made sense. But, one of the very most important treatment objectives we had was let's get you a bed. And really that honestly fixed a lot of what, I mean, it wasn't everything, but I think that's just such a funny example. And she laughed. I mean, she was like, "Oh, yeah,
All right.
right. I'm really uncomfortable."
The last time I slept comfortably on a blow-up mattress had to be like in college. I can't even imagine trying to
Yeah.
do that as an adult.
Man.
Yeah, they had PCSed and they just hadn't
Uh,
gotten around to getting a new bed.
Mm.
And she was making the best of it. And then there were other factors and issues, and one of them was his television watching while she was trying to sleep on the double air bed. So like there was lots of things going on, but I think it was funny that that piece was left out. So that's kind of a good example of that, stuff that can shed light on what's happening that a client might inadvertently leave out.
Yeah.
right. The self-report nature of
Yeah,
most of our information is limited by our self-report.
right.
Right. And that's a really good example of that. It's also funny that you brought up your first example as related to sleep because this is since I work a lot with insomnia disorders, this is an area of practice where having information and even engagement from collateral sources of information is so helpful. And I think about specifically, this happens all the time. I don't even have one specific story. I probably have 3 dozen particular stories of a patient who has come in with really significant insomnia. And one of the main things that I'm recommending is get out of bed when you're not sleeping, even if that means you have to get out of bed 6 or 7 times for the
Right.
first week, get out of bed. And inevitably, the patient understandably says, I can't do that. That's gonna disturb my sleep partner, my bed partner. They're gonna be
Yeah.
upset.
Yeah.
They're gonna be really frustrated. I can't do that to them. They're already, you know, they're already having to deal with my sleep problems. And inevitably, if either the bed partner comes in for a session or I just have the patient talk to the bed partner about the rationale behind it and the short-term nature of it, I have yet to hear from a bed partner who doesn't say, yes, please, do whatever you need to get him or her sleeping better because it's driving me nuts. And I'm fine with putting in those few weeks of I'm already disrupted. This is not going to
Right.
make a difference, right? And so that's an area of practice where I feel like information and engagement from other people in the person's life is really important and really powerful.
For sure.
I was thinking this is kind of a similar thing, but maybe on the treatment side of it. So, as listeners to the program, to the show know that I'm a PE trainer. Jen is a PE trainer. I've done a lot of prolonged exposure therapy throughout my career, and that's one of the things I really love to do. And if you're familiar with prolonged exposure therapy, one of the things that we do is we're identifying a list of things or people or places or situations that the person is currently avoiding, right? And so throughout the treatment, we're going to be trying to help them in a very intentional, very structured way to get back into those situations, to confront the things rather than avoid them. Of course, it's uncomfortable at the beginning, and eventually, the anxiety reduces over time. And not that, I mean, it's not part of the protocol to bring in a collateral like a partner or somebody else, but there certainly have been times where that's been extremely helpful. So, for example, I'm thinking of a particular client who, and this is so common that I don't think it gives anything away, but had put on their in vivo hierarchy, that list of things they're avoiding, going to one of those big box, very popular big box stores that
Hmm.
are across the US, right? And it shows up on almost every in vivo hierarchy I've
Right.
ever made.
Right. We all know
Um,
what you're talking about.
Yep,
Yep.
exactly. And, so that was one of those things that they eventually were going to work on going back into and confronting and being in that space. And their spouse was so nice. They were trying so hard to be helpful, right? They were really working on helping to reduce my clients' anxiety overall and their ability to function. And so oftentimes, not just that particular item on the list, but other times, other things that they were supposed to go to the grocery store or drive on the freeway or whatever it was, the spouse would, say things like, "Oh, you know what? I know that makes you so anxious and upset. Why don't you stay home and relax?
Hmm.
And I'll
Yeah.
go to,
Right.
to that place for you, or I'll get on the freeway, or I'll drive to the place, or I'll pick up the thing from the grocery store. You just stay here and relax." And of course, that's not terribly helpful, right? Because the point is for them to go back into those situations. The point is to have them experience that discomfort and realize they can do it. But it was one of those things where the spouse was intending to be helpful and was
Sure.
unintentionally undermining the therapy. And so we set up a scheduled time. It wasn't a therapy session, but it was a time where both could come in and not revealing anything confidential, but kind of explaining like, here's kind of the rationale for this treatment. This is what we're trying to accomplish. And what would be really helpful is if you could support them in doing the hard stuff. And it was like this epiphany. Like, oh, so I was really glad. I was worried that they would take it as I've been messing this up, but more of like, hey, cool. The energy is about helping and to contribute
Hmm.
here. I can turn that energy into supporting them doing this stuff that's kind of hard that they've been tending to avoid. So that was really great. And there's not just one example, but there's, like you said, multiple examples of
Yeah.
this where that's been such a turning point for somebody when their spouse understands what the point of the protocol or the treatment is and can get on board in supporting that.
I think that's such an important point that it's not, you could make it about shaming the partner and
Right.
saying, why would you do that? But the reality that's helpful for us to remember is some of these treatments that we do, particularly behavioral ones, kind of counter common sense or at least
Yeah.
counter our given understanding of how the world works, whether it's if you can't sleep, get out of bed, or if you want to avoid, go
Right.
do it anyway. That runs counter to what we would assume, and it will probably run counter to what the partner assumes as well. So just having that opportunity to get on the same page and educate is really
Absolutely.
helpful.
Yeah.
And I think we've been talking about those times where it all goes kind of smoothly, or we can get people on side
Yeah.
and our client agrees that this is a good idea. But I'm sure we've all had the experience. I mean, the bottom line is And this really goes back to the stigma associated with mental health
Yeah.
sometimes.
Yeah.
Our clients might have some significant privacy concerns and concerns about sharing that they're even in therapy or treatment. So what do we do, I guess, or do you have situations where that's been challenging, where you've really wanted to get some collateral information and a client has been like, oh, heck no. What do you do?
That's a tough one because, of course, again, we mentioned at the beginning, confidentiality is important. That's one of our core values, that this is an autonomous person and they have every right to their confidentiality. They get to control who knows about this.
And we don't
So,
want to undermine their autonomy. Like autonomy is
exactly.
something we're building,
Yeah.
right? And so how do we not send this message of, well, that's great from your side, but I'm going to need some other
Right.
information.
I'm
Be
going to do this
careful.
anyway. Or,
Yeah,
Hmm.
sorry.
yeah.
I just wanted to, that word autonomy, I think is so important.
Absolutely. And I think that's key, right? And I can't say that this has always worked out the way I intended it, but very often I'll want to have a conversation with my client. Like, here are the reasons why
Hmm.
I'm asking for this, right?
Yeah.
And absolutely you can make this decision. This is your decision completely, and we'll do what you want to do. Here are some reasons why I think it could be helpful. This is maybe the kind of information I'm seeking, or why this, has been helpful for people I've worked with in the past. And you know this person better than I do, right? Like, and you have expertise that are relevant here as well, whether or not that person could be an ally in this situation, or whether they have relevant information. You get to ultimately decide. So, I mean, I still, I think it's really important for us to respect that autonomy. And I think sometimes just providing that information. Here's what I intend to do. This is what I would want to do if you give me permission. This is what my purposes are. Here's how I think it could be helpful. And then ultimately it's still their decision.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that came up more for me when I was working in university counseling, because just the
Hmm.
age range and the kind of life state of those clients is unique, right?
Yep.
They're over 18, they're legally adults, still often very much connected to their family. Their family might even be paying for college, which means they're also paying for counseling
Right.
Right.
ultimately, right? There's there are just so many complexities to that age range, and having
And
some
I can't
clients.
relate to this at all in my current
I know I'm
life
giving you
of
news that you've
having two
never heard of
18-year-olds.
before.
Yeah, what do I
Uh,
do again? Sorry, keep going.
yeah, see if you can relate to this at all, Mama Jenna. So yes, Jenna, there are complexities, and although you might be paying for your kid's college, for example, you are actually not legally entitled to any of the information, right? But
Right.
there are plenty of times in treatment where it'd be really useful to either have that information, collateral
Mhm.
information from family, or to be able to touch base because something that is happening to the patient or something that the patient is doing is potentially dangerous, and you want
Hmm.
family
Right.
involvement. And so much like Kevin, it is ultimately, even in that case, that the student is autonomous. They own
Right.
their treatment, their legal rights to the treatment. And so my approach was much like you said, to have that conversation of, here's why I would really like this opportunity. Are there ways that we could do this that would make you feel um, more in control, more empowered in this situation? Is there one person who you'd rather I talk to than another?
Mhm.
And then I would add to that, sometimes it meant having that conversation multiple times, right?
Yeah.
And
Right.
especially
Right.
as things escalated or more trust was built, or whatever the case might be, I think something that was helpful for me in that capacity was not being afraid to come back to that conversation later and say, can we revisit this? Because I'm still having concerns, or I'm having even more concerns.
I love that. And I actually am going to listen to this episode repeatedly when I'm losing my mind over this personally. But I think as I heard you speaking about it, kind of it's funny because as clinicians, when we have somebody who's like, no, you can't talk to my parents, or no, you can't talk to my, XYZ, that kind of that's a little that sort of pulls on my little spidey senses a little bit. Like, well, tell
Hmm.
Mm,
me more about
why
Hmm.
that.
not?
What might they say, or what are some things that you think they'd come to the table with that would be
Hmm.
concerning for you, or that you think might impact, our relationship or my view of you, or so that's still good fodder, right? Like it's still
Mm-hmm.
something that we can still dig into. Ultimately, again, we need to go with the whole autonomy thing. And I love, Corinne, your suggestion to circle back. Or
Yeah.
maybe you get through one collateral and they realize, hey, she's staying subjective. Like my provider is actually staying subjective. She's still taking into my, she's critically evaluating
Mm-hmm.
the reliability or what this is adding, but she's still kind of taking my word for it too. So sort of, that
Mm-hmm.
positive experience of you taking in some collateral information, but still, because ultimately at the end of the day, it's through the eyes of the client anyway, right? Like it's their
Right.
Right.
worldview,
Right.
it's their experience, it's their um but understanding how, the impact that they have on others in the world or how that some of their behaviors are received can be really helpful. So, but I like that idea of visiting it repeatedly, maybe taking a stepped approach if there's somebody that they're less interested in you talking to, evaluate
Yeah.
what's going on there, and, maybe down the road we invite them in if you get more comfortable.
I like the way you say that too. Like, I think it's important to communicate to the client that, hey, we're not just assuming that this collateral person we're proposing to talk to is going to give us the capital T truth either, right? Like, we need to
Mm.
understand what they're telling us, given, whatever their motivations may be, who they are to you, what information they even have access to. And so it's not like I'm going to hear something from somebody else that maybe doesn't jive exactly with what you've been telling me, and I'm going to assume they're right, and I'm going to ask you why you've been lying to me. Like, understanding
Mhm.
that we're evaluating all this information through. So, for example, a couple of times when I was working in a military clinic, I would have somebody that was, as we've been working together, it was my professional opinion at least that they were kind of in a I don't know, precarious situation, maybe needed some limitations on their duty, and would write a profile for them. And then sometimes I would get a pretty angry sergeant or somebody, calling me up saying, "Hey, they're lying to you, they're snowing you, that they're not telling you what's right. You're just going off of what they're saying." And I had to, I had to be treading carefully because, of course, like this person that's calling pretty angry also has some important stuff they need to accomplish. It's possible that they have information about this person that I don't have that could change how I understand the situation. And so I'd have to be really careful, of course. Like I'd start off with, look, I can't confirm or deny that I even know this person that you're talking about because I don't have permission. But I can tell you that, if I was working with somebody in this situation, here are the things that I would be concerned about. You're certainly welcome to tell me what your observations are. Um, and I would take that into consideration, but I wouldn't, necessarily just revert to that. So, considering what information is coming and the source, and how reliable is that source for the purposes that we're going to use that information, is, I think, an important thing to tell our clients too. Like, hey, if I'm proposing to reach out to your spouse or your commander or whoever, I understand that this is another human being with their own unique perspective, and so I'm not just assuming that what they're telling me, if it conflicts with things you've been saying, is absolutely the right thing too. So,
Mm-hmm. I feel like we've had some good examples of times where it's been really helpful to get
mhm.
collateral information. We've also talked about times where we've maybe wanted collateral information and we had to work with the patient's reluctance to provide that and talk about that. Have there been any really bad experiences that anyone here has had where um, you
This is
got
what the
collateral?
listeners came for, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's what I came for. Have there been times where either we got collateral information that we didn't want or it went sideways and it went differently than we thought it was going to?
I can think of a time where I didn't seek the collateral information and they were really trying hard to tell me. Like,
Oh.
so yeah. So this is a client I had been working with for quite a while, on some deployment related trauma issues. We were doing prolonged exposure therapy. And I'd had, the client had mentioned to me a couple of times that they had kind of some friction with their spouse, and it was, troubling. One of the things that he didn't ever want to talk about his deployment experiences, partly because he felt belittled or not believed. And I'm like,
Mm.
cool, well, we don't have to do that then. So one day I'm showing up for a session, and I go to collect my client from the waiting room, and the spouse is sitting right there next to him. I'm like, okay, that's interesting. She came along with. And so I kind of walked up and I'm like, hey, you ready to go? And he stands up, and so does she.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, actually, like, I just need to talk to him today. And she goes, nope, I'm coming too. I'm like, So now, and in my head, I'm like, this isn't good. I don't need to have a conflict here. But that was not what this session was for, And so I kind of tried to gently explain that. Well, actually, I'm scheduled to see just him today. The stuff that we're gonna do really is just, for me and him to talk about. We can schedule another time that the three of us can talk sometime if he is okay with that. And she's like, well, of course he's okay with me coming today. You're okay with it, aren't you? Just really kind of badgering this person. And he even said, like, yeah, that would be no problem. I don't mind. And I wasn't sure that that was, honestly the truth. And so I just said something like, he may be okay with it. I'm not. So we can schedule a time, but I'm just gonna, talk to him today. And again, she kind of persisted. No, I'm coming back. That's just the way it's going to be. And I said, well, then we're just going to have to not have a session today at all. I'm sorry. That's not what the plan is. And she eventually got flustered, sat down, was really upset, kind of had pushed him some more, like, he's fine with it. And if he's fine with it, you should just do it, kind of thing. Anyway, she eventually sat down. We walked back to my office, and as soon as I closed the door, he said, thank you. Like,
Oh.
and it was kind of tough. It was, and it reminded me, like, I was wondering all the way back to my office if this was the right thing. Like, why am I being so
Right.
obstinate about
Mhm.
this? The patient says he's okay with it, and and I but I didn't have a chance to really talk to the client if he was really okay with it. That would have, of course, changed the nature of the session. We were not going to do a PE session with a
Mhm.
collateral sitting there. I don't care who they are and how supportive they are. That's not the point. We're not going to do that session. But I just wondered, like, okay, hey, is this really the right thing? Am I just being a jerk? Am I hoping to have extra time to write case notes, whatever?
Mhm.
And as soon as we got in there and he was like, thank you, it was like pretty clear that this wasn't one of those supportive collateral situations. We talked a lot about that, but
I'm really impressed with your limit setting. That
I
is
know.
I'm
like
me too.
great
Like that's
boundary.
not always, I don't always feel like I'm that rigid with boundaries, and maybe, and it could be better. That was one of those where I felt like I congratulated myself for having those boundaries, because it
Yeah.
it turned out that's what was needed. So
Yeah, that's what the patient needed. He needed
yeah,
somebody to externally place some boundaries to protect his therapy space.
right.
Well, and I think in those situations, it feels, obviously we're human, our anxiety goes up, and
Yeah. Yep.
the best thing to do is just slow things down. And by time, I mean, like, essentially, I'm gonna take my client back. We're gonna have our session. I.e., we're gonna talk about, do they even want you here? And there probably still could have been if he was like, Doc, I really like what she's got to say. I think is going to be really helpful. Then you pivot and you say, great,
Yep.
you know what?
Absolutely.
Let's give 5 minutes at the end to have a good conversation. I want you to guide that with me. So tell, how do you want that to go? And um, but don't jump and be like, oh, okay, you're here.
Yep.
So I
Yep.
love how
Yeah.
you slowed it down even. Like you held your ground, but you also slowed it down.
Yeah. Yeah. Well
So
done, Kevin. We're
Oh,
well
thank
impressed.
done,
you. That's really what I
Kevin.
came for, is for the validation.
Kevin, you do listen. You do listen. Look
Yeah.
at that, Corinne.
Thank
He
you for
does.
noticing.
We see you, Kevin.
All right. We don't want to be too nice to him because then he'll
Yeah.
get a big head. So should we
Let's
maybe talk about what we've learned from these experiences and a little any actionable intel that we can gather from our experiences?
Incoming actionable
absolutely.
intel.
One thing that I guess comes to mind, well, a couple of things come to mind for me. One is, of course, to know the legal requirements in your state, wherever you
Hmm.
practice for your discipline, because that guides a lot of who you can talk to, who you can't talk to, and under what circumstances you can do either. So, of course, first step is to be aware of your legal requirements and guidelines.
And I think related to that is, we're not talking about the limits to confidentiality that we talk about during, informed consent and that. But what's been really important for me is, like, preserving that therapeutic relationship. Like, we're not, they're, again, they're an autonomous person. We are not undermining their autonomy. We're not going to be breaking ethical requirements for confidentiality, but also be thoughtful about how will this disclosure or this, outreach, how's that going to impact the therapeutic relationship? How can I preserve that, strengthen that, while getting this extra information? We could do all sorts of things to damage the therapeutic relationship in pursuit of collateral information, and it's important to have that collateral information, but preserving that relationship is really important. I think that's why, when it comes to those limits of confidentiality situations, duties to warn, or their harm, danger to themselves or others, it's tough for us, because in those situations, if they don't want us disclosing things, that kind of damages the therapeutic relationship. And it's not just in those circumstances. We need to be mindful of that. So keep that in mind, preserving the therapeutic relationship.
Well, then I'll add one more thing to that, which is that I think in addition to that piece of it and the legal pieces of it, in regards to preserving autonomy, also being really clear about why you would want that collateral information, what it is that you're seeking to get, and communicate that to the patient. Let that be part of the discussion and setting the stage for why you would want to talk to that collateral and what the limits are going to be to that discussion.
And while Corinne just took some of what I was going to say,
you're welcome.
I think it's an opportunity, as we're talking about communication and autonomy. If we're, some clients, there's not going to be a lot of ambivalence. They're going to be like, yep, I think they'd be helpful, bring them in. But for those clients who are ambivalent about it, what do we have to deal with that? And my brain goes right to MI and listening to understand, really not having an agenda, but really like being there with the client to listen to how it might serve them to have someone else give their opinions and observations, how some of the concerns that they have, and really, again, kind of giving space for that. It's not that we don't have an opinion. I mean, I think, again, part of that, why behind it, they may not, it's not just tattletelling or, we really can talk about as we're sort of like really looking at the function of all the stuff that's going on for you. And we're putting together the formulation about how all these things are connected and operate. Sometimes somebody else's understanding of that just really can be insightful, right? And if we're kind of like robbing ourselves of that opportunity, if we don't get that additional information, and at the same time, your view and you're driving this process and that autonomy piece, but like, don't forget you've got these other skills to help you get through that ambivalence or help you talk to that client in a way that's really gonna enhance that therapeutic alliance at the end of the day. And then the thing I'm going to add on top of that, which is probably Corinne's next idea, is consult. Like if you've got a sticky situation where you're not sure, you've got either kind of like a Kevin situation where you've got a very aggressive collateral who's wanting in, or you really feel like this isn't all adding up. I'm not getting the full picture. I really need collateral, consult, get your colleague, or, again, if you're in our PE consultation or current CP consultation or any of the other consultations that are available, I think it's a great place to really muddle through and protect the client and protect yourself.
And for my mom who's listening to us on her smartwatch on the treadmill, MI in this instance is motivational interviewing.
And thank you, Kevin's mom, for always being a supportive listener. Well, with that in mind, that might be a place to at least temporarily wrap up this conversation, though I feel like we could keep going for a long time with more examples and more concerns. So maybe we'll come back to this in the future. But we would love for people, including Lauren from North Carolina and Kevin's mom on her treadmill, to reach out with feedback and questions and anything else that you want to hear about, as well as times where maybe you had to reach out to a collateral, or you had a collateral reach out to you unexpectedly, and tell us about it and share your story. We promise not to share any identifying information of yours on the podcast.
We can call that collateral conundrums.
Ooh, I like that. We need a sound effect.
7.
If you have collateral conundrums, let us know.
The CCs.
Man. Almost like that, like our running theme maybe for next season. Maybe.
We'll have to
Stay tuned, listeners.
And in the meantime,
stay curious
and mind your EBPs.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Remember, we love hearing from our listeners, so leave us a message on SpeakPipe or send us an email. Both can be found in our show notes. Our theme music is Failed Attempts by Nitro, and our administrative assistant is Bree Mercer.
Thanks for listening to Practical for Your Practice.
If you like what you're hearing, please feel free to follow us, rate this episode, and share it with others.
Until next time.